Hello everyone, my name is Jason Woolley, and on behalf of the ITS I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar, which has got two excellent panels within it looking at sort of European Union ICT cybersecurity issues. And first of all, I'd like to thank Squire, Patton, Boggs for organising this and for hosting, and for all the effort that they put in to bring it to fruition. And we were originally due to have this just at the worst possible time of the outbreak of COVID across Europe. So it's very nice to see this actually coming to fruition today. I'd like to thank all the speakers on both of the panels for volunteering their time today to talk about what is, I think, a really interesting and sort of timely set of issues. And I would just on that point, just to briefly sort of say how this very much aligns with the objectives of the ITS. So this panel today is looking at something that is been mulling around, been talked about, but it's actually coming to the fore again in the last couple of weeks. And that being timely and being sort of the moment is something that the ITS has sort of strives to do in its work. What we do is that we're a global organization of academics, consultants, industry participants and regulators who come together in meetings, primarily traditionally conferences, the old-fashioned way before COVID of face-to-face, and where we discuss issues. And with the advent of COVID, we put on a series of webinars which are tackling a series of issues which we think are timely. We've had the impact of COVID on working from home. We've had discussions around track and trace apps. We have today's around cybersecurity, and we have one in a couple of weeks' time around artificial intelligence. And what, as I say, we strive to do is be timely, be interesting, but also try to be relevant. And I think this is a very relevant and a very welcome set of discussions today. So I want to thank Squire, Patton and Boggs and all the speakers very much. And now I'll hand over to Brian Harnett from the host. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And we don't want to spend too much time giving thanks, but we want to thank the ITS for coming together with us in order to present this, and to second his welcome to everybody. By way of introduction, my name is Brian Hartnett, and I head up our global competition team. I just wanted to say a few words with regard to our firm's involvement in today's program. It essentially stems from a recognition that our clients require and deserve insights into policy considerations, which not only spawn the laws which impact their businesses and upon which we advise, but also how such laws should be interpreted and indeed used, and perhaps most importantly, to anticipate and prepare for future legal developments that will impact upon their market activities. Today's subject, cybersecurity and European ICT policies, is in many ways a perfect example of where law and policy intertwine. The discussion is taking place against a backdrop of considerable global sensitivity and potential conflicts. The US has opted to use what we would term as traditional trade barrier instruments to further strategic goals. And this, of course, in turn is creating unfavorable conditions for global supply chains and for certain vendors blocking their access to Western network operators. As a competition lawyer, I'm conscious that the reduction in competition is likely to have a negative consequence for network operators and their customers. And the EU, for its part, is not asleep. It is developing its sophisticated and extensive processes for screening foreign direct investment and specific processes for certain aspects of technology development, such as the toolbox on 5G security. There's talk of European champions and open strategic autonomy, two terms that I'm sure will be referred to during today's program. The panels, as Jason was saying, will explore where European industry stands in all this turmoil. And in the later panel, there will be an analysis as to whether new technologies and mitigation strategies will eventually resolve the problems for the European industry. But enough for me. This is where I turn to the real substance and hand over to my colleague, Matthew Kirk, to introduce his program.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you all for joining us. I think you set the context for this discussion extremely well. We're living through a time in which two things which are slightly contradictory are happening simultaneously. One is that COVID has accelerated the adoption of technology in our day-to-day lives and in our business lives at a really extraordinary rate. We've seen a whole load of new technologies coming into our lives as a result of that, but also a huge reliance on the technologies that have been being built over the last decade or two in telecommunications and the internet. And at the same time, as Brian said, we face a time when the global trading context within which technology moves is being challenged in a way that it hasn't been really since the Cold War, as the strategic rivalry between the US and China heats up. We obviously have a significant political event happening in the US next week. That may or may not bring about changes in US policy, but as somebody who travels to the US a lot and follows US policy closely, one area which is highly unlikely to change very much, whatever the outcome, is the underlying approach to China. And so the challenges that we all face in managing technology relationships will be with us come what may in the US presidential elections. I've got a fantastic panel. I'm delighted and very grateful to all four of them for joining us here. I'll briefly introduce them. We have Piers O'Donoghue, who is European Commission's Director of Future Networks, with long-standing expertise in this area. We have Dr. Paul Timmers, who is Visiting Research Fellow at the Centre for Technology and Global Affairs at the University of Oxford, a noted and leading academic in this area. We have Richard Spearman, who is Group Security Director at Vodafone, obviously one of the leading telecommunications companies in Europe. And we have my colleague, María Viñals, who joins us from Madrid, and who has great expertise and long experience in international trade matters, and particularly trade sanctions matters. So that's our lineup. We're going to start with each of the four panelists saying a few words to introduce some thoughts into the discussion. And then we'll start to sort of run a discussion in the panel, which I will attempt to moderate and keep on top of with the technology that we have. And then it's very much up to you to ask questions as we go along. Please do use the Q&A function. I will try and pick up your questions and bring them to the panel as we go through. So let's make an immediate start, and I'd like to start by asking Piers, thank you very much for joining us, Piers, to give us a quick outline of Commission priorities in the ICT area. And Brian mentioned this concept of open strategic autonomy. It would be fantastic if you could say a word about that. So please set the policy scene for us, Piers.
And good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. But that last sentence was a very dangerous open invitation for me to speak for the next hour and a half, and none of your experts will then be able to respond. So I will try to be brief and therefore slightly telegraphic, because a lot of the agenda has been set deliberately by the Commission in the early days of the von der Leyen College, setting out its strategies in the forms of communication, saying this is what we're going to do, and very much wrapped up by the President's State of the Union speech. And quite frankly, long before that even happened, my Commissioner, Tariffs, was telling us, do it and do it now, because he's absolutely certain that we really have to act very fast. Because what we're doing on digital strategy in general, on digital technologies, ICT, what we're doing on industrial policy, and specifically and particularly what we're doing on data, all revolves around the need for Europe to have its own innovative, open and strong capability in this family of digital technologies, digital and data technologies. And you will hear me throughout the afternoon put a particular emphasis on the data, as well as the critical infrastructures that underline and underpin that data, but sort of allow the economy to operate. What we see is a situation where increasingly Europe could be falling into a situation of critical dependency in one or other element of the value chain. And that is something which wasn't the perfect example, but COVID has shown once again why, if you are a demander, if you are receiving technology, even supplies from elsewhere, it just takes one geopolitical shock like that to completely upset the running of the economy. When you add to that the ongoing geopolitical psychodrama of the trade war between the United States and China, and they happen simultaneously, then you come to a situation in which the European economy is fragile and it clearly needs to have its own robust ability without closing the door on competition, on innovation and on cooperation. But to make that happen, while we still believe, even if someone accuses us of being naive, in diplomacy and in others also believing in the mutual benefits of the open trading system, the open internet, etc. Cybersecurity is, if you're strong there, you can assert yourself without being aggressive, but you can also defend yourself where others are being aggressive. Hence the focus, and that's why I welcome this discussion today. So there are a number of existing pieces of legislation or regulation in the European Union. Many of you will be familiar with the work done previously, for example, on the NIS directive, but also more recently on the cybersecurity framework and that block which is just finishing now as we seek to have final agreement on the Cybersecurity Competence Centre to pool the resources of member states in cybersecurity, energies in the efforts there in the work that's being done at national level. There will be further work, and this is already something which we're working on in terms of the NIS directive, and of course in return in the terms of a cybersecurity strategy, BIS, or perhaps with another name, in order to ensure that we keep a pace with the ambitions set by the Commission, but also, unfortunately, that we are keeping a pace with these geopolitical threats that I've referred to, where the situation does not look like it may stabilize anytime soon. And then there are things that were referred to already that I have a more direct involvement in, for example, the 5G toolbox, which has become our modus operandi now in other areas, where creating that common set of tools which creates security but also transparency among the member states who have a significant, very significant element of national competence in these domains, that we are all working in the same direction. When it comes even to the technological standards that underpin some of these tools, that they are known, tested, robust, and can be seen by third parties, third countries, as being reliable and based on best practice globally rather than on some protectionist measure or motive. And that is precisely what we're doing as we move forward in the rollout of 5G, but will increasingly be the approach that we will take in relation to other technologies. Blockchain is itself a technology with a security element, but of course there are many flavors of that, and we have to ensure that it is both coherent and safe. And then in terms of our high performance computing capacities, the rollout of an innovative secure and environmentally friendly computing continuum from cloud central as we know it out to the edge. And here I circle back then to the questions that you want me to answer, is that as we move rapidly to edge computing, to where the device will operate in a very localized computing environment, swapping data, generating data, and receiving data, that is where we have to ensure, as I've said, that our tools, the tools that we provide to ourselves, the menu from which, or the toolbox from which the member states and individual actors, the companies, the users particularly, the tools that they draw from are robust, are certified and secure, and are, of course, at the cutting edge of technology. So another element to our work, because of the way that you've titled this seminar, which is Strengths and Weaknesses in EU ICT Cybersecurity, I couldn't not speak about EU research and innovation, where again, through the programme already announced, we will have a significant further investment in incentives and in financial assistance to research and development in cybersecurity at both the physical, the cyber physical, the software and the platform layers, to ensure that we have robust end-to-end security in the systems. And then lastly, and I hope already I haven't been too long, there is then the dimension that has been referred to that you want to talk about, which is that of security, of sovereignty. Now the phrase has been bandied about a lot. Commissioner Patton himself sought to clarify very clearly what we were talking about, which is that it is open. It is in the context of the interdependencies at a global level in this modern digital economy, where anyone who is prepared to follow the rules in European Union is not just able to, but is welcome to operate and provide products or services in Europe, provided they follow the rules. And as the ministers themselves declared, all 27 EU ministers signing a declaration last week on European Cloud Federation, while we understand that there will be companies from third countries who are subject themselves to foreign rules of jurisdiction, the services and particularly the facilities or infrastructures which they provide in Europe, they cannot be subject to foreign jurisdiction. They are subject to EU jurisdiction. And that includes, in particular, our data protection rules, but also, of course, our cybersecurity rules. But in that context, we have an open situation, an open trading environment where we wish to be connected to others and want others to connect with us. But where, given what I've talked about at the start, is the geopolitical risks, Europe can be sure in a competitive and open environment of having secure supply chains, of having its own access to IP and the technology that is then created in order to ensure that we can be not just players, but leaders in global digital technologies. There's lots more things I could say, but I know there's lots more interesting things. I look forward to hearing the other speakers. So thank you for my opening salvo.
Piers, thank you very much. You've given us a wonderfully rich menu, so we will dive into that. And Paul Timmers, could I come to you next? And I want really to pick up from where Piers finished there. And Piers referred to the interconnectedness, the openness. Clearly, technology itself is a tremendous breaker down of international barriers. But at the same time, increasingly, it is central to how critical infrastructures work and things which, as Piers said, even within the EU still are within the field of national competence. Could you comment a bit on how you see the challenges for national policies reflecting through this increasingly interconnected world, and what the experience of the rapid digitization of the world over the last few months has taught us in that area?
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also a great pleasure to see Piers, my former colleague, here in the panel again. So about the national policies, on the one hand, they are tremendously challenged in the field of cybersecurity and technology policy, digital policy in general, very much challenged. At the same time, I think that is perhaps my little bit optimistic conclusion. More than ever before, are the European countries willing to work together in the field of digital and in particular also in the field of cybersecurity. But there are great challenges to actually do work together. If I just go back a little bit in history, in 2013, the European Commission put on the table the Network and Information Security Directive that Piers was already referring to. And I remember that at that time, there was quite some opposition to it because a number of countries said, well, but this is really touching national security. That's not a domain in which you should be active. This protection of critical infrastructures belongs fully in the domain of national security. How much has that changed, as a matter of fact? Today, you have something like the 5G security toolbox. Well, the core of 5G security concerns is actually about national security. And what happens? The countries are asking the European Commission to bring all of them together around the table and then to jointly develop a toolbox for 5G security. So now, as a matter of fact, apparently, even though national security is still there is the understanding, and this was 2018 or so that work happened on that toolbox, 2019, that there is the understanding that you can only deal with these kind of challenges if you work together. And by the way, the European Commission also has an important role in that. And I think that also says a lot about kind of the credibility that the colleagues in the European Commission have been able to build up between the member states, the trust and the understanding that it does make a lot of sense to sit around the table and develop such an agenda for 5G security jointly, even if it touches national security. So a lot of change there. And that change happens, in fact, because the member states become ever and ever smaller in the geopolitical world. There are these huge tensions that have only been growing over the years geopolitically, and that's US, China, but that's also transatlantic challenges. There is EU, Russia. There are the challenges from going digital, as you already say, the digitization. And that's not just that digital is so disruptive in the way we work and we do business and we live and we educate, but that there is also digital dominance, and the digital dominance is not coming from Europe. The latest example that we have seen with COVID, and I would like that everybody is aware of that the platforms that we are nowadays using for education are all non-European, virtually all new. And what are these platforms going to do? Collect data about students, kids, pupils, and it's a Facebook story all over again. So that's a place where things start to matter, that it's not only about cybersecurity, but it's also, and not only about data protection, but it's indeed also about the sovereignty. So the topic that has come onto the table is this topic of sovereignty being under threat. Geopolitically for Europe, digital disruption, the digital dominance, and obviously very much cybersecurity threats that go deep into the systems. You mentioned critical infrastructures. Sure, it's a disruption of those, the continuity, but it's also the theft of intellectual property. In 2017, I think the report of the intelligence agencies in the Netherlands said that the greatest threat for the future of the Netherlands, the future economic prosperity of the Netherlands, was actually intellectual property theft, in particular by China. Now, all of that kind of threatens sovereignty, and the approaches that I also see in my research from dealing with sovereignty is, so which means do you mobilize, how are you capable to defend your sovereignty? There are basically either you do it on your own, which is perhaps to some extent the US and the China approach, or the approaches that are more open for the European Union, which is you kind of muddle through the best you can do, a risk management approach, or you work together with strategic partners, the like-minded partners in strategic partnerships, or you pursue what I would call the global common good, the things that are in the interest of the world and humanity in general. And the internet is actually an example of that, used to be an example of that. Today it's the splinternet, but originally it started as something that was rather a global common good. So the open strategic autonomy point, that question is in my interpretation rather that we are seeking as European countries strategic partnerships with like-minded European countries. and perhaps others that are like-minded, and that we have a strategic interdependency where it matters with those that are not like-minded, like China, for example. And that's understood. That makes sense in global business. So countries are becoming smaller. They realize, first of all, they cannot deal with the cyber threats and the digital dominance threats and the geopolitical threats on their own. They have to work together. And that's where new initiatives like Gaia X or the data spaces are very well finding their place as collaborative initiatives. Secondly, I think increasingly people are starting to see we are actually building up sovereign assets that are really belonging to all Europeans. If we say .eu, the domain name system, it doesn't belong to a single country. It doesn't belong to a single European, it doesn't belong to a single company. It belongs to everybody in Europe. And so that's a sovereign asset of the Europeans. The same holds for data spaces, and the same may hold for Gaia X. That does not mean that you cannot work together with others on that, but they are something that you feel it belongs to us. And when I say it belongs to us, I'm actually quoting literally Commissioner Breton when he talks about data that are produced and processed in Europe. They belong to us. And the third reason is you're only a credible partner, and Europe is a shrinking credible partner. I think we have to be very realistic about that. You're only a credible partner if you've got anything to defend. So building together sovereign assets and building together strong cybersecurity policies, for example, gives you a stronger position in the world. Also, to pursue approaches that I would very much actually like to see discussed, the approaches that are not only in this narrow group of like-minded, but that are more for the global common good. Let me just finish off here with national policies that refer to another national policy, the US national policy, that came out. You know it well. That came out a week ago. That's the report on critical and emerging technologies. They identify a list of critical and emerging technologies. The whole report is a strategy report from the White House. What the US should do has been written from the perspective of national sovereignty. Absolutely, national security and sovereignty. And they propose three approaches. Either the US does it on its own, exclusive lead, or they do it with like-minded partners, or they do it on a risk management approach. What I find a bit of a pity is that the US no longer seems to propose, let's do a number of things globally. We are a global leader, for example, in open source, in open standardization, in open global networks like 5G, etc. We are apparently for the US beyond that point. I think Europe still has a position there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Fascinating reflections there. Perhaps, Richard Spearman, I could turn to you next. And you work in a company that buys a huge quantity of technology each year. And that process has been a broadly commercial one for many years, but is becoming a more political one. To what extent do you think technology procurement needs to take geostrategic concerns into account? And how do you think the COVID experience and the increasing dependence on technology and what technology produces in terms of data and services and so forth has reinforced the importance of that question?
So thanks for the introduction, Matthew, and thanks to the two previous panelists for setting a really interesting context. I'm sure we're going to have a fascinating debate, so I won't take too long over this. I think the key thing, as you say, Matthew, so much has changed in the last 6 months, and one of the things I would like to offer up here is that we are in a position where we're going to have to reimagine quite a lot of what we do, and I think whether that's about how we're going to have working and the economy is going to work in the future, it's certainly going to include where we get our technology from and how we assure it in a way that builds the sort of infrastructure that we're all interested in delivering. I think we've always taken some account of geostrategic concerns, but clearly from a commercial perspective and from a technology perspective, we've tended, as you say, rightly to major, I think, on what will suit us best in terms of delivering the best possible service to consumers and to governments. And the question of where it comes from and who builds it and what impact that has on the supply chain has definitely not been front of mind in the way that it clearly is now. For us, what we're looking for always when we buy is quality, resilience. We always do look at avoiding over-dependence, over-concentration in the supply chain. And ideally, that would include geography too. So we don't want to be dependent in a way that, as we've talked about, individual shocks or a combination of shocks can lead us to be caught without what we need. But globalization has made that much less straightforward, in the sense that parts of your supply chain, reaching into every part of your supply chain and understanding exactly where everything comes from, and therefore being able to effectively scenario plan how it might be that a shock or a change might impact you is incredibly difficult. What we want really is always stability. We want stability of supply, and that's obviously, as we've seen recently, to a degree, quite considerable degree, contingent on sort of geopolitical stability. And we want it to be sufficiently diverse in terms of the number of sources that we can use, and not least because we are critical national infrastructure. And I think the telco sector and the communication sector more generally has had an extraordinary COVID. If you look at what we've had to do in terms of the amount of new equipment we've had to buy during this period in order to support the growth in demand for our services, it's huge. We've also had to completely reorganize the way in which our services deliver, in the sense that the demands have shifted because people are working from home. The timing at which they do things has changed as their lives become more flexible. And if you look at the things that we have underpinned, we've generated the ability to work from home in a way that has helped us safeguard economies. Those bits of the economy that can be done from remote working have been facilitated by it. We've connected students and teachers in order to continue education. We've provided vital communication services for people unable to meet one another, and we've provided really valuable data to governments for them to be able to manage the pandemic. So in some ways, you could say, well, what's wrong with that? What needs changing? And I think what we're finding is that clearly, as governments take these decisions, and I thought that the division between common good, national security, sovereignty, all of these concepts as they come together are having a real impact on the way in which we need to make our choices going forward, and also on the choices themselves. So as the number of suppliers of this equipment that we can use with national government's consent, and because we're regulated and licensed, we always need to have government's consent in order to be able to operate. So we are always subject to regulation, and that's right and proper. But in this space, sudden changes of mind, sudden decisions that make changes to what we are and are not allowed to use in certain jurisdictions causes real issues for us. So to the extent that we don't have stability, and to the extent that geopolitics does intrude, we end up in a position where we have real uncertainty about cost, real uncertainty about planning in terms of we can't assume interoperability. It's just not like that. You need your network to be structured in certain ways to provide the sort of resilience that Piers was saying that we needed. So we have to make changes to our networks, and we're already Sweden was the latest example where they're saying that certain types of equipment won't be available to use. You've got the UK, you've got the US, and as that spreads, clearly that has a massive impact. So I think in answer to the question, do we need to take it to geostrategic concerns into account more? The answer is yes, sadly, but we do have to be realistic about this, and to the extent that we can anticipate it, we must. But to the extent that it happens to us because governments change their minds, we need to talk about how we're going to do it, how much it's going to cost, who will fund it, how long it will take. And so I think the question of getting the supply chain right is really important. So and my final point would be, therefore, what does that mean in the European context in particular? Strategic autonomy, a really important concept. We want to participate in both understanding what governments mean by that and what the EU means by that. We want to commit to helping to develop that. We're very much in favour of developing protecting the existing European champions in our sector, but also of developing new businesses, new industries in order to support, for example, the development of Open RAN. So I think there are lots of things that we can do, and what I really want to see is a a deepening of the partnership between industry and government, because we do talk to one another. Obviously, as critical national infrastructure industries, we spend time together and the regulations are discussed with us, etc. But I think it's got to move to a whole new level, because ultimately understanding the complexities that we face and the opportunity costs that come with the things that we the decisions that we need to make. So do we want to push ahead with 5G rollout, or do we want to swap out existing kit? These are real choices, and the pool of money for doing that is the same. So we've got to make those choices, and I think we can only make those in the best possible way if we're in the closest possible partnership with government. And the final thing I would say on the EU in particular, I think the EU did a fantastic job in coming up with a single cross-EU risk assessment. I think the toolbox is proving more challenging to get single instantiations of that across EU member states. But the extent to which we can mitigate the feeling that the need for national security considerations to take primacy in member states, the extent to which we can mitigate that by getting the right common baseline and agreeing it and trying to put it out there in a non-fragmented way, or a non-augmented way, as I would say, because we're seeing lots of additional things being placed on us by governments, will make a real difference to the speed with which we do roll out future technologies, we do build the trust that we want, and we can get on developing and exploring the exciting new opportunities offered by 5G and new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pepe Viñals, if I could come now to you, underlying this whole discussion, there's been a trade policy aspect, and as we said at the beginning, we've seen the US in this administration increasingly using trade policy as an instrument of its broader foreign and strategic policy, particularly in the digital area. Could you comment a bit on what you're seeing there and how these mechanisms are working in practice?
Sure. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to the other panelists and for their insights and thoughts, which I understand are very interesting, and I'm sure we're going to have a very good debate afterwards. Answering your question and what regards the United States and its policy, I mean, it's interesting to see that ICT, which are information and communication technologies, goods, which also include devices and applications related to communication, are about 10%, a little bit below 10% of the United States total GDP. So this sector is extremely important for them. So they have been using different tools and different policy. I mean, using tools to either together with other countries in a multilateral basis, or by using free trade agreements on a bilateral basis, or unilaterally protecting their interests. And their interests are at some stage contradictory, because on one hand, the US policy wants to open new markets, enhance digital trade. And on the other side, and especially with the Trump administration, there is another main scope or main goal for their trade policy, which is protect their sovereignty and their private and national security. So they are constantly balancing these two main principles. Traditionally, the United States trade was conducted through the World Trade Organization to foster the free market. And what happens is that within the WTO, there is only the Information Technology Agreement, which is enforced by the member states. But this regulation only applies to the imposition of tariffs and taxes in ICT goods, but it doesn't tackle the non-tariff barriers that have become more and more important and a source of conflicts in digital trade, which are, I mean, some examples are localization requirements, cross-border data flow restrictions, intellectual property rights infringement, national security standards, or burdensome conformity assessment. So if we take that into account, and we see that the US, especially in the past 4 years, has not been supportive of WTA and has blocked in some way the institution, by blocking its dispute resolution mechanism, then we can see that WTO needs a strong support by whoever is going to be sitting in the Oval Office in the White House. But at this stage, it doesn't look like the correct place to be discussing and getting to agreements in this type of policies. The US is also active in other multilateral forums, which also deal with digital trade and that encourage as well non-binding best practices. These forums are, I mean, like G20, the OECD, or the APEC, APEC. And as well, there is another tool that has been successfully used, for example, with the European Union, which is the regulatory cooperation. And a clear example of this is the United States and the European Union Privacy Shield that was entered into force in July 2016 and provides companies with a mechanism to comply with data protection requirements when transferring personal data between the European Union and the United States, covering what has become one of the biggest, I would say, achievements, which is to allow the cross-border data flows between the European Union and the US. And all this translated into money amounts to 1.2 trillion US dollars of import-export related to digital trade that is done thanks to these cross-border data flows. So as well, these tools and mechanisms, which are not in the front pages of the most important media, are extremely important as well for the US agencies and European agencies and other agencies from other countries to get together and think how to get things done and protect their interests. So that would cover what we can call the multilateral ways of doing public policy in trade by the US. More and more, and due to the WTO stalemate in reaching a comprehensive WTO multilateral negotiations, and the fact that digital trade is unevenly treated in existing World Trade Organization treaties, they have made free trade agreements a key tool. And it's a key tool to set the basis of digital trade and limit non-tariff barriers, which are not as well and easy to identify as tariffs. Some examples of US free trade agreements that deal with digital trade are the one that was entered into with Singapore in 2003, the one that the US has currently in place with South Korea, or the US MCA between United States, Mexico, and Canada. These agreements, they have common grounds, and it is said in the wording that it is of high importance to recognize e-commerce as an economic driver. As well, they all state that that there has to be a non-discrimination of digital products in the trade between these countries. As well, they promote removing trade barriers to e-commerce. They promote cross-border information flows. And they as well promote between governments and agencies dialogues to develop e-commerce. So this is something which is as well within the US foreign trade policy and has been positive in the digital trade sector. And then we have the third block of measures or tools, which are unilateral measures that are taken by the US administration. And we can subdivide them in three. One of them are the tariffs, which we have seen the tariff battle between the US and China throughout 2018, 2019, and the beginning of 2020. We have seen as well export controls going into higher or escalating the barriers to enter the US market from an administrative perspective, bureaucratic perspective, etc., and as well sanctions. So if we start or we see or look at the sanctions, that brings or makes international trade a much more complex place, and it causes a lot of headache to our compliance and legal departments when wanting to fulfill the US sanctions to not to get in trouble with the US administration, at the same time looking at contradictory regulations or laws, as for example the blocking statute from a European perspective, or the national security law that was passed by Hong Kong, China, regarding or establishing that it is a criminal offense for any company doing business in Hong Kong to follow and comply with the US sanctions. Or more and more, we start to see other countries like Russia or even Venezuela and others to pass their own blocking or countermeasures law against sanctions. So at the end, I mean, what happens is that it makes, we need to take into account different jurisdictions, different principles, and we need to evaluate what are the risks of complying with or fulfilling a specific regulation, and what are the consequences in some other part of the world, and from the company that is, if they want to do business there or if they're doing business there, from the consequences that may arise in another jurisdiction. So, I mean, we have some cases as, for example, the inclusion by the US government of Huawei in the entity list, and the effect that this inclusion has had in the sector and in the supply chains of many companies, but not only for American companies like Google or Apple. They were exporting, importing, using Huawei, incorporating their technology or their apps in Huawei devices, but also for European companies, for example, that had part of their supply chains in China, and they were targeting the US market from there because they wanted to make their devices or their products more cost effective, or because they had the facilities in China that they were using to do this type of work and this type of manufacturing. So these policies, which are unilaterally taken by the US government, do have a clear impact in non-US companies and US companies. And we all have to go through our supply chain, through our suppliers list, through our providers list, and see if we can bridge this type of bans or sanctions or export controls, or if our products are going to be subject to additional tariffs and we're not going to be competitive anymore, because another government from a different jurisdiction has taken these measures and has put them into place and have clear extraterritorial effects and directly affect my business and my company. So more and more we're seeing that, and that makes things more difficult. As well, cybersecurity is another threat which directly affects national and private security, stealing private data, or intellectual property thefts, or even espionage for other governments, are some of the reasons that have led the Trump administration as well to take specific measures, as for example forbidding WeChat and TikTok applications in the US market, or limiting their use. And in 2015, when Obama was still at the office, a cyber-related sanctions program was passed to go against cyber criminals on a worldwide basis, without prejudice of where they were or from where they committed cyber crimes. Until today, there are 30 individuals and entities that are in that list from different countries, especially from Russia and Iran, and they have been designated special designated nationals, SDNs, which means that any of their assets is frozen and they cannot deal with US dollars and they cannot enter the US territory and some other restrictions. So cybersecurity is as well on top of the table, and it is excused as well, which is largely used by the U.S. policymakers to make their decisions. So, I mean, making the story short, and as a way of conclusion, we can say that policymakers in the U.S., they are on the one hand trying to open new markets, trying to get multilateral, bilateral agreements to get their companies in new markets, enhance digital trade, but at the same time they're taking opposite measures that are protectionist, that have extraterritorial effects, that limit their companies from allied countries like European Union companies based on their national security. So that's those are my thoughts that I wanted to share. And back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Pepe. Well, there's a very rich menu here now of issues that we can pick up. Do please feel free to use the Q&A function on your screens to ask any questions. I'm going to move the discussion on a little bit or take it into a little bit more detail. I'm tempted to ask Piers how like the US, the EU will look in 5 years' time, but I won't ask that because I think that's a rather unfair question. I'd like Piers perhaps to look at another aspect, which is the question which has come up underlying quite a lot of the interventions, including your own, about new technologies and about how we should think about the regulation of new technologies in particular. And on from that, the application of new technologies, you obviously have general frameworks like GDPR, the new Data Act when it comes and so forth will create general frameworks, but you also have new technologies being used in other sectors such as automotive or healthcare. And how do we think about the regulatory intersection between technology regulation on the one hand and sectoral regulation on the other? So a bit please about the relationship between regulation, new technologies, and how we feel our way into that.
Thank you. Yes. By the way, my answer to your question, if you had asked me, would be, well, it depends very much on who wins the election next Tuesday. But that's not the question that you asked me in the end. So on the one that you did ask me, which is very important, one of the rules that we've always tried to apply to the European Union is that we should not and cannot afford to kill the technology or kill the innovation by over-regulating. So there are times which regulation, or certainly detailed regulation, is too early. You have seen that discussion very clearly because it's been very public with our member states, but particularly in and with the European Parliament with regard to artificial intelligence, for example. So I would give three parts to my answer with regard to new technologies and regulation. The first is, it's not regulation, but it's vital. It's the role that we play, but just as importantly, that European companies play in the standardization process. We have a strong European standardization framework in the what used to be called sort of the telecommunications area, but of course it's much larger in the ICT area, and that has always been open, and in many cases it has influenced global developments. In particular, technologies such as 3G, 4G, 5G, We have a global body which is dedicated to these technologies, the 3GPP, but again, where Europe and European companies have played a role. But standardization in terms of security, standardization in terms of the safety of a product in digital terms, in cyber terms, etc., is where the work has to start, as the technology is actually being developed. And that brings me to my second point, which again is not regulation, but is very much part of the regulatory environment, and that is security by design, and specifically now cybersecurity by design. Because in many cases, when the horse is bolted, we find ourselves going back to the technologists and saying, how does that work? And what can you now do to patch it to make sure that that cybersecurity weakness is somehow overcome? Whereas, of course, through enabling, through financing, but also through standardization and guidelines on best practice, we can ensure that from the very early inception stage, that the security features of a product, of a software, etc., are in mind. And then, in terms of regulation, as you come to it, first of all, we back that up by making sure that somebody who doesn't invest in security by design, somebody who cuts corners, does not gain a market advantage, and in fact is penalized. In other words, that they are not operating to these high standards, and they are not including that in their business plan, in their costs, in terms of business process to bring a product or service to market. And then we have, if we set those standards on European companies, we are in a very strong position. We've heard a lot now about WTO, etc., from Jose María. We are in our rights to object to other products coming into the European market if they don't meet those self-imposed standards and rules. And then we get to the regulation as you, I'll refer to you now as a lawyer, Matthew, but as we talk about it here in Brussels as well a lot, it is clearly that the more generic it can be, the better, because first of all, as I said, we don't kill the technology. So if we're not relatively technology neutral, if we're trying to be technology specific, we'll always be running after the innovation. We'll always be running after tomorrow's developments. So that is really a key. So if you look at the NIS directive, which I and Paul have referred to, we are now, after 4 to 5 years of application, looking at the NIS directive and looking at the way that the markets and the technology have evolved. And yes, the proposals for the NIS directive will seek to change the scope to a certain extent as to how it is applied, as well as to refine on the basis of experience and further impact assessment, how it affects the market and can drive the market while reaching our objectives. But because that directive and regulation, as it was originally intended, was always looking not to be technology specific and to be future-proofed, we don't have to throw it away and start again. We have a model which needs to evolve. And there are other examples, and we will seek to do that as we implement our Cybersecurity Act and as we move to cybersecurity certification as being a critical issue. Then again, we want that to be robust, to be able to adapt to change, and not to impose excessive cost on providers or users if and when we have to adapt because of developments. And those are the guiding principles, Matthew, for regulation, which I hope sort of answers your question. It is hopefully evident from what we've been saying about artificial intelligence, about blockchain, about edge computing, about data technologies, and so on. And it is also, I hope, evident in the way that despite the obvious and patently clear cost that the GDPR does impose on everybody, that too is something which sets principles and which allows then the regulation, but also the business environment to adapt to developments in technology. There you are. That would be my first attempt to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Piers. Paul, do you want to comment on this aspect, and particularly the comment is sometimes made that not actually of the Commission, but of other parts of the EU institutional framework, that the application of the precautionary principle can be an inhibitor of innovation and broader adoption of new technologies. How do you evaluate this?
Yeah, I think to some extent you see the discussion now, for example, coming up around AI and especially high sensitive applications of AI. And I guess that the experience learns about the precautionary principle that, first of all, you have to explain it very well so that people aren't scared away right away. Secondly, you really have to think about what is harm to humanity, not harm that may come potentially from this or that application, but something that is quite sizable. And that's also how the precautionary principle has been applied in the past. If you think about what we did at the time about a hole in the ozone layer, that was actually the measure that was taken there, which was a global protocol, Montreal Protocol, was based upon precautionary principle, because it was clear that if we didn't act, we would create massive harm to humanity in general. So without starting to talk about precautionary principle in general, I would bring it down to areas where it really matters most, where it's most obvious, so that we can also start to understand how you then would apply that and not start to put that in the way, in a general sense right away. There's perhaps one comment that I if I may, challenge Piers a little bit on let's say technology neutrality. So I think what you see is that we have to deal with the instruments that we have today, and law is a rather static instrument. Law has difficulty coping with technology change, but that's also because to some extent we are perhaps not smart enough, because we don't combine lawmaking with, for example, putting in place an innovation instrument. So I think there should actually be no law proposed in this area that doesn't have an innovation program back to back with it. And that there is a link, an actual link between the law and the innovation program. In other words, you monitor what is happening in innovation that might perhaps relax your legal requirements. Let me give an example of that. Suppose that you're talking about the protection of your data, take in the area of cloud processing because of personal data protection, and because at some moment in time you expose the data because you have to do data analytics, and then you say this is so sensitive we cannot bring these data outside Europe, so this has to happen in Europe. Localization requirement, the moment that you start applying AI to data. What if you would have smarter analytics technologies like homomorphic encryption that actually are able to analyze below the level of the encryption? Then your data can never be exposed by definition. That would mean that you would have a much more flexible way of dealing with this sensitive issue also internationally. And if you're then smart, I would say, make sure that this homomorphic encryption is being developed and this AI is being developed in Europe. So have an innovation program that flexibly can deal with requirements that you put into a cloud policy, to give an example. And there are plenty of these examples that you can actually mention. So I think technology neutrality, perhaps we have to think a little bit further what we actually mean. We shouldn't mean that the law is there forever and static.
Thank you, Paul. Could I turn perhaps to Richard and Pepe, and just between you, maybe Richard first, dig a little bit deeper into this question of the impact of US policy. Pepe, you referred to the US decision to put Huawei on the entity list, which is on the one hand quite a technical and detailed thing that they did, but with very wide-reaching ramifications. I'd also make the comment that a lot of these mechanisms that the US is using, and indeed that the EU has available to it as well, in terms of controlling the flow of technology, are ones which were invented primarily to control sensitive military technologies during the Cold War, when most innovation was being done within essentially state-controlled frameworks. Now, a lot of the most advanced innovation is happening in the private sector, in global companies which don't operate to the same kind of security standards as a defense infrastructure unit, whether private or public sector. So how does this relationship between the tools of technology transfer control and the way in which we're actually using technology work today. Pepe, Richard, does one of you want to go first on that one?
So I think it is important to say just how dramatic the US interventions have been, and how effective, if you're sitting in the US, in terms of limiting the access of certain providers to not just their national market, which is where they started, but with the extraterritoriality to the wider market. But I would say the problem should be seen in a broader context, which is that the number of suppliers of that sort of equipment have been declining for some time. So when we used to put out tenders for equipment 7 or 8 years ago, we'd have maybe 10 or 12 offers of comparable equipment, which we could then sort of chew over and decide which we wanted and which made most sense in terms of the balance of having more than one provider in our network in order to ensure resilience, etc. So now, fast forward to now, where we only have really 4 major global providers. 2 of those are European, and 2 of them are based in China. Then obviously, if you remove one and have another one under a sort of compliance mechanism, which they do, which is ZTE is the second one, it makes it completely unbalances the supply chain as was. Now, you can argue about the merits of it, the reasons for it, the drivers for it, but the practical effect for the consumers in terms of the telco companies is significant and serious. And one of the reasons why a lot of people now are investing so much hope and effort into the Open RAN projects that are going on is as a way of actually providing genuine diversity going forward. It's not because people want to undermine the existing European champions. There's absolutely no way that we would want to do that anyway. But in a situation where we face a tight and apparently shrinking choice in a number of countries, then having more providers is part of it. And Open RAN is very different in terms of the architecture and offers up other advantages as well. So I think it's been very effective. And I think the problem I see from a geostrategic point of view, as opposed to just from my position within Vodafone, is that clearly, if you've got as much innovation as we have got going on in China as well as in the US, clearly, bifurcating supply chains in by whatever means that comes about. And China spent some time this week refining the measures that it could use to reciprocate the sort of actions we've seen in the US with the new export laws and various other things they're introducing. I think as a global citizen, to Paul's point, and doing things which are of a global good, the idea that innovation only takes place in the West Coast Europe or and not in China is not right, and the idea that we can't. We're restricting the way in which we can benefit seems to me to be definitely a global harm. So I think it's very practical, it's very real, and as Jose said in his presentation, the amount of work that goes into now assuring whether or not you're complying with everything that might have extraterritorial effect. And also your confidence in that, and also so even beyond the impact of the strict application of the regimes, there comes a sort of nervousness about well, if I for the avoidance of doubt, I'll move away. So it's a very disruptive set of measures, and I think that's, again, national governments need to make decisions about national security and what they think that is right to have or not to have. It's not for companies to do that. But what we do need to do is, when they make those decisions and when these acts are brought into force and we have to go through the processes, everyone needs to understand the opportunity costs, and the risks that come with shrinking the choice. And the last point I'd make is that national resilience is very different from corporate resilience. So I think one of the other lessons of COVID for me is that we could plan for ourselves to be resilient, but that's not the same as at a country level or indeed an EU level. So there's something here about the level of transparency between what companies are doing that we have to sort of guard from a competition law point of view, but actually from a planning point of view and risk management point of view going forward, having much more of an understanding of what everybody's doing is going to be part of building national and sort of supranational resilience. And so there's something here about changes we're going to need to make in how we do that, and that's why I think this partnership idea is so important.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pepe, any brief comments from you?
Well, I agree with Richard's approach, and I would add that, I mean, what's going on as well brings an opportunity for those companies that have the flexibility to find new ways and new channels in their supply chains to be able to fulfill and comply with the different regulations, or with the regulations of the country of destination of the products you want to sell. So for many companies, they will have to be, I mean, they're now sitting around a table thinking what they're going to do, but for others, it can be an opportunity that they can benefit of. As well, from a regulatory risk perspective and compliance perspective, companies as well, they seek more and more the assistance and the support of their public authorities. So, for example, European Union companies, whenever they are they are obliged or they have to comply with the blocking statutes, for example, and they need to go against the extraterritorial effects of the US sanctions. I mean, they seek a full support of the European Union authorities for that. And maybe I know this is a very complex subject, but as well, maybe the European Union blocking statute that dates, I mean, the regulation, which is from the 1996, should be updated as well to take into account that there are many other laws and acts that are being passed or that are at this time in the Congress of the United States that also have extraterritorial effects, and our companies need, our European companies need as well protection and a clear way on how to proceed. And just one last idea as well for regulation and making regulation and adapting regulation to the new technology and the innovation. I think sandboxes are a fantastic tool that has proven to be very effective in the United Kingdom, in Singapore, and many other jurisdictions to test in a playground and not put in risk any security or privacy or from other, from the consumers or market players, and bring the regulator and the authorities into the playground and be there from the first minute and see how the technology works and do a good and tailor-made regulation that would help enhance the industry and promote the good things that they can see there and prevent and bind the points that are negative and that are originated from a bad use or a misuse of the specific technology. And this is something I wanted to share as well with other panelists. I mean, what do you think about the use of sandboxes?
We're pretty much at the end of our session. I wanted to, and maybe Pearson, because I'm about to turn finally to you, and maybe you could pick up on Pepe's question there as well. But I had a question to you which came from what Richard said about this sort of multiple levels of resilience and how corporate resilience and the way that companies think about their own operations needs to dovetail with a broader, more systemic resilience at national or EU level. And my question is whether competition is still the best way to build what are increasingly the critical infrastructures for the digital economy. If you could briefly address that, but also pick up any other points you've had that you want to talk to.
Yes, I know we need to finish. So very quickly, I'd say on regulatory sandboxes, of course, is something we've tried in the past, normally on very technical regulation. One area I worked on in the past was spectrum regulation. I'm not so sure whether with some of these wide-ranging technologies, particularly where it's very hard to track and control inputs and also the flow of data, that they would be as efficient. But my mind is open. I'd love to see how it might work. Then just on Open RAN, which was mentioned, that is something which we, of course, are looking at a lot. And I do think that it is something which, if we can take away the hype, and if we can take away some of the inevitable political interest that exists in the United States, because they do not have a native supplier in this very narrow market that now exists. But if we can actually look at it from the point of view of resilience, as Richard has referred to it, but also competition, then yes, then something that again will be very useful, despite the ironic fact that 2 out of the 3 global players are European. Now, on the main point then, to Richard's point, etc., about that resilience, it is the case that it includes choice in supply, because it does not go, as some seem to think outside the European Union, that by creating a global champion, if you, whether as a country or as a region, have the champion who then becomes some form of monopolist, that you have achieved resilience. That's not the case, or certainly it won't be in the long run. You're much more likely to find that somebody will come with a disruptive technology, but also that the price is huge in terms of geopolitical disruption against others who oppose or object to having a monopolist, basically. So resilience is actually reliant on competition, and competition is therefore one of the key instruments, Matthew, as we go forward. In fact, you could say that to a certain extent, some of what we're saying now and talking about it in terms of technology sovereignty or whatever is just good competition practice, i.e. achieving a competitive market. But it does, and we have to face up to this, it does go further. The geopolitical threats, which I referred to at the start and others then echoed, really do exist. And when we see bad actors, including very powerful state actors, and not just China, I mean, let's face it, in this space, who have jumped a generation of capability and capacity, and who are serious threats because they do not hesitate to use what we would definitely label as illegal and aggressive practices to forward develop their own industry and to undermine systems in other places. That means that we have to be able to protect ourselves against that. That is why the digital single market, that phrase might not be as popular now, but the digital single market provides Europe with the critical mass that we need to be able to operate independently if required, even though, and I go back to this as my last word, it is our vocation, it is our wish that we remain part of a global, open and innovative and competitive system, but one in which these basic rules of security, protection, respect of the individual, and then also, like the ozone layer Paul referred to, climate change considerations, provide the floor of regulation for everybody.
Thank you very much indeed. And we're going to close this panel now. My very warm thanks to Piers O'Donoghue, to Paul Timmers, to Richard Spearman, and to Jose María Viñals. I think we've explored a lot of issues, a lot of very important issues. My colleague, Dr. Georg Selenci, will be chairing the next panel, but I wanted to end this one with very warm thanks indeed to our 4 panelists who brought fantastic insight, knowledge and clarity to a very wide range of issues. Thank you very much.